Good morning. When I went to one of our brilliant vaccine centres just a few weeks ago, I saw something extraordinary. People arriving by the dozen with anxiety etched on their faces. Many of them hadn't been out for months. But as our brilliant NHS vaccinated them, I saw the anxiety drain away, and they left with smiles, broad smiles on their faces. And it's that spirit of hope and optimism that I want to start with today, a spirit we've seen too little of in the last year. The dedication of our frontline workers, the skill of our NHS and the brilliance of our scientists, and of course the solidarity of the British people, now point the way to a better future for our country and allow us to glimpse how we can thrive again as a nation. COVID has shown us the best of Britain, but it's shown our fragilities too. This virus has a deadly ability to find the most vulnerable and to expose deep inequalities and injustices. We have to seize this moment to address that. I believe there's a mood in the air which we don't detect often in Britain. It was there in 1945, after the sacrifice of war. And it's there again now. It's the determination that our collective sacrifice must lead to a better future. In a few weeks' time, we'll have a budget that will offer a simple choice, a fork in the road. We can go back to the same insecure and unequal economy that's been so cruelly exposed by the virus. Or we can seize the moment and go forward to a future that's going to look utterly unlike the past. That choice will define the budget. That choice will define the next election. We know what the Conservatives say they want to do. They want to build back. But I don't want to go back. You can't return to business as usual, and certainly not to an economy rooted in insecurity and inequality. I want our country to go forward, to embrace the change that's coming in science, technology and work, and to be ready to face the future. And today I want to set out how we can build that future together. COVID, of course, is not only the worst health crisis in memory, it's the biggest economic convulsion in 300 years. We've seen the worst death toll in Europe and the worst economic crisis of any major economy. Now, I've said a lot about the incompetence of the government's handling of the pandemic, and I make no apology for that. They have been slow at every stage. They've ignored advice. They haven't learnt from their mistakes. Yet a government out of its depth is not even half the story. The terrible damage caused by the virus to health and to prosperity has been made all the worse because the foundations of our society have been weakened over a decade. 10 years ago, at the start of this period of Conservative government, Professor Michael Marmot published a report on the state of England's health. In February of last year, he updated it, and he's done so again in the shadow of COVID. That shows that even before the pandemic, life expectancy had stalled for the first time in a century. Child poverty had shot up to over 4 million. And that a child growing up in a deprived area in the northeast can expect to live for 5 less years than a child growing up in a deprived area in London. What sort of legacy is that for a party that's been in government for a decade? That life itself got cheaper and shorter. In his most recent report, Marmot sets out the costs of inequality, that COVID got into the cracks and crevices of our society and forced them open with tragic consequences. And during the last year, my thoughts have returned time and again to the wartime generation, those who suffered through the horrors of World War II, who rebuilt Britain from the rubble of the Blitz, created the NHS and built millions of homes fit for heroes. And I contrast that with how so many of them were left in their time of need, exposed to COVID in underfunded care homes, unable to say goodbye to families and to loved ones. How can the Prime Minister now look those families in the eye and say, we did everything we could? When the truth is that the Conservatives promised to fix social care for a decade, but never got round to it. But the problem is even bigger than the serial failures of this government. It's about an ideology that's failed, an ideology that's proved incapable of providing security for the long term, that's indifferent to the moral and economic necessity of tackling inequality, and that left Britain unprepared when we were tested most. Our care homes are perhaps the clearest example of this. But we've seen the same tragic story in overstretched hospitals, in GP surgeries, in schools with ever-growing class sizes, in our once proud town centres and high streets, in an economy so insecure that millions of people can't afford to isolate, and where the lowest paid have been amongst the most exposed. These are the inevitable consequences of a decade of decisions guided by the notion that government can't interfere with the market, that you can strip back public services, ignore inequalities, and take money out of the pockets of those who need it most, only to look the other way when the consequences of those choices become clear. This pandemic has pulled back the curtain on that way of doing things. This must now be a moment to think again about the country we want to be. A call to arms, like the Beveridge Report was in the 1940s. Our chance to diagnose the condition of Britain and to start the process of putting it right. That's the path I would take in the March budget, to begin a new chapter in the history of our country and to equip Britain for the opportunities of the future. Well, I fear that the Conservatives are incapable of seizing this moment, that what we'll get on the March the 3rd will be short-term, that it won't even be a fix. Successive Conservative Prime Ministers have used the rhetoric of change, northern powerhouses, burning injustices, levelling up. But all it ever adds up to is a few sound bites and the odd photo opportunity. The truth is, whoever their Prime Minister is, the Conservatives simply don't believe that it's the role of the government to tackle inequality or insecurity. They believe a good government is one that gets out of the way rather than builds the path to a more secure future. You can get away with that in the short term, perhaps even for a few years. But after a decade, the results are obvious. So the mistakes the Conservatives are making today are the mistakes that they always make. They try to pretend this is a different Conservative Party. Well, you could have fooled me. If you can't decide whether to plunge hundreds of thousands of children into poverty by cutting universal credit, you have no chance of mending our broken system. If you vote against children getting free school meals, you're not going to find the solution to millions of children growing up in poverty. if you can't support 3 million self-employed people, but you can spray billions on contracts that don't deliver for the NHS, you're not going to be able to build the economy of the future. And if you freeze pay for millions of key workers, you're hardly going to build the high wage, high standards Britain that we so desperately need. That's why, despite the scale of the moment, all we can expect from this government is more of the same. A roadmap to yesterday. Another decade of insecurity and inequality. Labour would choose a different path. A path that is focused on the long term, that tackles inequality, invests in the future, and builds a more secure and prosperous economy. That journey starts with the responsible steps that are necessary now to protect family incomes and support businesses. As the OECD, the IMF and the IFS have all indicated, the public finances must be returned to sustainability over the medium to long term, not in the short term. So this is no time for a second wave of austerity. This is no time for tax rises on businesses or families. That would waste the sacrifices of the last year, and it would choke off our recovery. That's why a Labour budget would protect families. We would not cut the £20 uplift in universal credit, benefiting 6 million families by £1,000 a year. We'd provide local councils with the funding they need to prevent huge rises in council tax. And we'd end the insult of a pay freeze for our key workers after they've given so much. And a Labour budget would also back British business by extending business rate relief and the VAT cut for hospitality and leisure, by easing the burden of debt that weighs down on so many businesses, and by extending and updating the furlough scheme so that it's better able to help people back into work. We'd also fix the gaping holes in the government's Kickstart job scheme. It really does show how badly this government has let people down, young people down. That on average, 292 young people have become unemployed every day. But the government's flagship scheme only supports 13 jobs a day. That's one job supported for every 22 jobs lost by young people. We also need to use this budget to build a more sustainable, secure economy for the long term. Now, the Chancellor is pinning his hopes for recovery on short-term consumer spending. But as the Bank of England have said, the vast majority of savings built up during the pandemic won't be spent. Now, that's understandable, but it won't help rebuild our country, and it won't do much to help save us. There's an opportunity here to think creatively, to build on the spirit of solidarity we've seen in the last year, and to forge a new contract with the British people. The British people invest in rebuilding an economy that's more secure, and the government provides financial security for millions of people, many of whom have saved for the first time. If I were Prime Minister, I would introduce a new British recovery bond. This could raise billions to invest in local communities, in jobs and in businesses. It could help build the infrastructure of the future, investing in science, in skills, in technology and British manufacturing. It would also provide security for savers and give millions of people a proper stake in Britain's future. This is bold, it's innovative, and it's an example of the active, empowering government I believe is needed if we're going to build a more secure economy. The budget is a pivotal moment, but I also want to lift our sights, to talk about the decade to come. Under my leadership, Labour's priority will always be financial responsibility. I know the value of people's hard-earned money, and I take that incredibly seriously. And I know that people rightly expect the government to look after their money, to invest it wisely, and not to spend money we can't afford. Those are my guiding principles. But I think that COVID has shifted the axis on economic policy. Both what is necessary and what is possible have changed. The age in which the government did little but collect and distribute revenue is over. The mistakes of the last decade have made sure of that. I believe people are now looking for more from their government, like they were after the Second World War. They're looking for a government to help them through difficult times, to provide security, to build a better future for them and their families. A government that knows the value of public services, not just the price in the market. A government that invests in British skills, science, universities and manufacturing. That provides world-class education for all of our children, and whose driving mission is to tackle inequality from birth. A government that can ensure people don't have to leave their hometown to have the chance of getting a good job, and won't leave university with crippling debt. A government that can build a new generation of affordable homes and not stand idly by while millions are denied the dream of home ownership. A government that can work with trade unions and businesses to shape the future of work and harness the opportunities of new technology. A government that will ensure care homes are places of dignity. A government that reflects our values on the world stage and that puts tackling the climate emergency at the centre of everything that we do. That's what I mean when I talk of a future where Britain can be the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. But none of this is possible if you don't believe in the power of good government and the need to create a new partnership between an active government, enterprising business and the British people. The Conservatives are incapable of this. They simply don't believe it's the duty of government to deliver social justice and equality. That's why in the end they'll always fall back on the short-term demands of the market. But if we're honest, for too long, Labour has failed to realise that the only way to deliver social justice and equality is through a strong partnership with businesses. Under my leadership, that mindset will change. I believe in the power of active, enterprising government, working alongside British business. Not because I believe business is something to be tolerated or taxed, but because I know governments can't do this on their own, and that a new partnership with British business is the only way to secure our economy, to build strong families and a prosperous country. The vast majority of businesses know this too. They know the days of ignoring their social and climate responsibilities are long gone. In fact, many businesses are waiting for politicians to catch up. A new partnership with business, one where we have high expectations of business and where business can have high expectations of Labour, is pivotal to my leadership and to my vision for the future. It's also personal to me. My dad worked on the factory floor his entire life. A steady, secure job allowed him to build a better life for his family. That's why when I think about business, I see a source of pride, of dignity and prosperity. And I know there is no vision of a future where Britain fulfills its potential, in which business does not thrive. Britain is to succeed in the world. And if we're going to be ready to face the challenges of the 2020s and the 2030s, we can't waste anyone's talents. We can't accept that some regions of our country are being held back. We can't accept that if you're born into a deprived background, you'll have worse life chances. Or that if you're from black, Asian or minority ethnic communities, you'll face structural racism and discrimination at every stage of your life. The Britain of the future, the Britain I want to build, is going to need the talents of everyone. Inequality is not only morally bankrupt, it's economic stupidity too. A fair society will lead to a more prosperous economy. It's not the choice of one or the other, as the Conservatives would have you believe. You either have both or you have neither. Harold Wilson once said that the Labour Party is a moral crusade or it is nothing. He was right. Our moral crusade now is to address the inequalities and injustices that this crisis has so brutally exposed, and to build a better, more secure future. Thank you. I think we'll now go to the media, and hopefully, yes, we've got Jonathan from the BBC. Jonathan, good morning.
Good morning, Sir Keir. Can I ask you, does your policy of recovery bonds risk, in the short term at least, allowing the rich to become richer while offering nothing for those who are struggling financially due to the pandemic, many of whom may be former Labour voters who turned their backs on your party at the last election? And how do you assess the challenge of winning them back by 2024?
Well, Jonathan, no, on the contrary. One of the problems of the past has been the short-termism of our economy coupled with austerity. I've given the bond as an example of a longer-term, secure way of investing. Many people have, I think, saved for the first time during this pandemic, and as the Bank of England says, they're unlikely to spend it in a hurry, and this gives them the security of a bond going forward, and also helps the country secure that economy. So it's actually part of an argument about how we go forward, that fork in the road that I described. As for winning people back, winning votes where we've lost them, that obviously is a question of trust in the Labour Party. And I think it's important that at this point I set out, as the vaccination programme is being rolled out, it is fantastic. We now can talk about what comes next. And what I'm saying is there's a fork in the road, and we must not go back to business as usual. We have to go on to a better, more secure future. Thank you, Jonathan. I think we've got Sam next from Sky. Sam.
Sir Keir, you spent 2020 focusing your attacks on Tory incompetence, but Boris Johnson's hugely successful vaccine rollout rather blunts that charge. So you've defaulted today to familiar arguments about Tories underfunding public services, embracing austerity and increasing inequality. Those arguments didn't win Labour 3 general elections and lost strongholds like Accrington, where I am today. What makes you think that this case will work better this time?
Well, Sam, I have criticised the Prime Minister and the government for being too slow on pretty well every occasion. And I stand by that criticism. I am very pleased the vaccine programme is being rolled out so successfully. And thank you to all those on the front line, particularly the NHS, who are actually rolling it out in that way. But I think there's a duty now, as we face the future, to be honest about the choices that are before us. As we come out of this, do we want to go back and try to repair what we had before? Or do we move forward to a better and different economy? And I think this is a moral and political choice that we now have to make. And that's the case I've set out in the speech that I've just given. Because if we go back to where we were before, we're going back to a model that had inequality and injustice built into it and put us in a position where we weren't as robust and ready as we should have been going into the pandemic. So this is about not just this budget in March, but where we go for the next decade. Thank you, Sam. Libby, I think, ITV. Libby,
Keir,
hi.
We've heard in the React survey today that rates of coronavirus in London are coming down very sharply now, but they're falling much more slowly in the northwest and northeast. How concerned are you by these regional discrepancies, and what would you do about them if you were Prime Minister?
Look, firstly, I'm really pleased to see the rates coming down. I think we all are. And I think that shows that these restrictions are working. And that's why we backed the government in those restrictions. I think we need to be cautious and careful. That's what the Prime Minister is saying. I think he's right about that. Careful and cautious as we come out of this, because we've got to make sure that this lockdown is the last lockdown. Not make the mistakes we made before, which is to come out too quickly, come out cautiously and slowly. That's the language the Prime Minister is now using, and I think he's right about that. And it's why we support the lockdown that we're in. Because, as I say, I think across the country, everybody wants this to be the last lockdown that we can then move forward to the future. Thank you, Libby. I think we're now going to The Guardian with Jess. Jess, morning.
Hi there. Keir, you say that there's no time for tax rises on businesses. Does that mean that Labour would oppose any attempt in Rishi Sunak's budget to raise corporation tax? And another really quick one, if I may. Johnson and Sunak have both, clearly spent 300 billion on COVID rescue measures. They are working already with the private sector in a huge partnership with volunteers to deliver a vaccine programme. And isn't it obvious that they also believe, as you put it, in this partnership between an active government and enterprising businesses? So what is Labour offering that is distinct from that? And perhaps you could say whether that means that you still believe there's a role for renationalisation of key industries.
Well, Jess, the point I'm making about tax rises is this, that tax rises and a return or a return to austerity risk throttling off the recovery. And that's why it's very hard to find any economist out there that's suggesting that we should do either of those things, because what we need to do is to recover as quickly as possible and not throttle it off. On the wider point about the government, it's very important with this Prime Minister not to just listen to what he says, but to look at what he does. And there's a world of difference between the path I've just laid out and the path that he is going down. obviously I've focused on the last 10 years of austerity, but just look at the choices the Prime Minister's made recently. Council tax hikes, a pay freeze for key workers, and an indecision at the moment about cutting back the £20 on universal credit. These are not the signs of a government that understands that the future needs to be different and that the insecure, unequal economy of the past has to be in the past and that we take a different path going forward. So I don't think that what Boris Johnson says is anything near what I've been saying this morning. And I think the fork in the road is very, very clear. And I've set out very clearly what I think is the right course for our country going forward, not just in the next few months or next few years, but over a decade. So thank you, Jess. The Telegraph, I think, with Tony Diver. Tony.
Thanks. Okay. Your critics say that you've gone too soft on the government during this crisis, but you also don't want to be seen to politicise the crisis and the recovery all the way until the next election. So how can Labour win back voters without being seen as point scoring during the crisis? And to your critics, Ed Miliband said that he was tough enough. Are you radical enough for Labour?
Well, Tony, just on the pandemic, what I said on the very first day I became leader of the Labour Party is we'd be a constructive opposition. We're in a global pandemic, which puts huge strain on any government, and everybody understands the challenges. And what I said we would do was be constructive in the sense that we would support the government where that was the right thing to do. So, for example, on the various restrictions and the lockdowns, we have been fully supportive of the government, even when, in fact, their backbenchers were not so supportive because it was the right thing to do. But we've challenged them where we thought they were getting it wrong in order to try and make sure, above all else, that they got it right the next time around, whether that's testing, protective equipment to the front line. Now, I don't think that's soft. I think that's the national interest. I think the public would say, in a time like this, you back the things that the government is doing right, and you challenge them where you think they're getting it wrong in order that they improve on that. And I think that's the right. Everybody is concerned that we pull through this and pull through it together. That then raises your second point. Where do we go from here? And if anybody wants to understand my thinking and judge it in whatever way they want, I'll hand up my text and they can have a look at it, because what I'm setting out is what I think is the path we need to take for our country for the next 10 years, and making it very clear that we can't go back to business as usual. We can't go back to where we started and say, well, let's try to repair what we had and carry on with the model that we've had from 2010 to 2020. I'm saying we've got to take a different path, and setting out what that different path is for a better, more secure Britain. Thank you very much, Tony. And then Richard, I think, from the Eye. Richard.
Hi there. Just a couple of quick ones, please. What exactly would the money raised from this bond be spent on? And just another very quick one. Why do you think you're still lagging behind in the polls? Thanks.
Well, the bond money could be spent on any number of things. What I said in my speech was infrastructure, on jobs, on the rebuild. The point of a bond is, in a sense, it provides funding for infrastructure, for those vital things that will be needed going forward. But it also gives people a stake in the future of their country in a safe way and in a secure way. And it's an example, and it's only an example, of the long-term thinking that I think we need going forward. In terms of the Labour Party and direction, obviously I've now set out very clearly where I think we should go over the next 10 years. We are in a pandemic, and I'm conscious that we, the Labour Party, have got a lot of work to do, and we're determined to do that. That starts, I think, by setting out clearly what we see are the choices for the next 10 years and why the path I've set out this morning is the right path for our country. Thank you very much. Thank you.